John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer and sex offender who raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. Gacy regularly performed at children's hospitals and charitable events as Pogo the Clown or Patches the Clown, personas he had devised. He became known as the Killer Clown due to his public services as a clown prior to the discovery of his crimes. Gacy committed all of his murders inside his ranch-style house near Norridge, a village in Norwood Park Township in suburban Chicago. Typically, he would lure a victim to his home and dupe him into donning handcuffs on the pretext of demonstrating a magic trick. He would then rape and torture his captive before killing him by either asphyxiation or strangulation with a garrote. 26 victims were buried in the crawl space of his home, and 3 others were buried elsewhere on his property. 4 were discarded in the Des Plaines River. Gacy was convicted of the sodomy of a teenage boy in Waterloo, Iowa, in 1968 and was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, but served 18 months. He murdered his first victim in 1972, had murdered twice more by the end of 1975, and murdered at least 30 subsequent victims after his divorce from his second wife in 1976. The investigation into the disappearance of Des Plaines teenager Robert Pius led to Gacy's arrest on December 21, 1978. His conviction for 33 murders then covered the most homicides in United States legal history. Gacy was sentenced to death on March 13, 1980. On death row at Menard Correctional Center, he spent much of his time painting. He was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center on May 10, 1994. Early life. John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois, on March 17, 1942, the second child and only son of John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robeson. His father was an auto repair machinist and World War I veteran, and his mother was a homemaker. Gacy was of Polish and Danish ancestry, and his family was Catholic. His paternal grandparents had immigrated to the United States from Poland. Childhood. Gacy was close to his mother and 2 sisters, but endured a difficult relationship with his father, an alcoholic who was physically abusive to his family. His father also belittled him, calling him dumb and stupid and comparing him unfavorably with his sisters. One of Gacy's earliest memories was of his father beating him with a leather belt for accidentally disarranging components of a car engine he had assembled. His mother tried to shield her son from his father's abuse, which only resulted in accusations that he was a sissy and a mama's boy who would probably grow up queer. Despite this mistreatment, however, Gacy still loved his father, but felt he was never good enough in his father's eyes. In 1949, Gacy's father was informed that his son and another boy had been caught sexually fondling a young girl. His father whipped him with a razor strop as punishment. The same year, a family friend and contractor would sometimes molest Gacy in his truck. Gacy never told his father about this, afraid that his father would blame him. Gacy was an overweight and unathletic child. Because of a heart condition, he was told to avoid all sports at school. During the 4th grade, Gacy began to experience blackouts. He was hospitalized on occasion because of these episodes and also, in 1957, for a burst appendix. Gacy later estimated that between the ages of 14 and 18, he had spent almost a year in hospital and attributed the decline of his grades to missing school. His father suspected these episodes were an effort to gain sympathy and attention and openly accused his son of faking the condition as Gacy lay in a hospital bed. Although his mother, sisters, and few close friends never doubted his illness, Gacy's medical condition was never conclusively diagnosed. One of Gacy's friends in high school recalled several instances when his father ridiculed or beat his son without provocation. On one occasion in 1957, he witnessed Gacy's father emerging drunk from the family basement to begin belittling, then hitting his son for no apparent reason. Gacy's mother attempted to intervene as her son simply put up his hands to defend himself. According to the friend, Gacy never struck his father back during these altercations. Career origins. In 1960, at age 18, Gacy became involved in politics, working as an assistant precinct captain for a Democratic Party candidate in his neighborhood. This led to more criticism from his father, who accused his son of being a patsy. Gacy later speculated his decision to become involved in politics was actually to seek the acceptance from others that he never received from his father. The same year Gacy's political involvement began, his father bought him a car. He kept the vehicle's title in his own name until Gacy had finished paying for it. These monthly payments took several years for him to complete. His father would confiscate the keys to the vehicle if Gacy did not do as he said. In April 1962, Gacy purchased an extra set of keys after his father confiscated the original set. In response, his father removed the distributor cap, keeping the component for 3 days. Gacy recalled he felt totally sick and drained after this incident. Las Vegas, Springfield, Waterloo, Iowa. KFC manager. After a 6-month courtship, Gacy and Myers married in September 1964. Marlon's father subsequently purchased 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. The couple moved there so Gacy could manage the restaurants, with the understanding that they would move into Marlon's parents' former home, which had been vacated for the couple. The offer was lucrative. Gacy would receive $15,000 per year, plus a share of the restaurant's profits. Following the obligatory completion of a management course, Gacy relocated to Waterloo with his wife. He opened a club in his basement where his employees could drink alcohol and play pool. Although Gacy employed teenagers of both sexes at his restaurants, he socialized only with the young men. Gacy gave many of them alcohol before he made sexual advances. If they rebuffed him, he would claim his advances were simply jokes or a test of morals. Gacy's wife gave birth to a son in February 1966 and a daughter in March 1967. Gacy later described this period of his life as perfect. He had finally earned his father's approval. When Gacy's parents paid a family visit in July 1966, his father privately apologized for the physical and emotional abuse he had inflicted throughout his son's childhood and adolescence before happily saying, "Son, I was wrong about you," as he shook Gacy's hand. Waterloo Jaycees. In Waterloo, Gacy joined the local Jaycees chapter, regularly offering extended hours to the organization in addition to the 12 and 14-hour days he worked managing the 3 KFC restaurants. At meetings, Gacy often provided fried chicken and insisted on being called Colonel. He and other Waterloo Jaycees were also deeply involved in wife swapping, prostitution, pornography, and drug use. Although Gacy was considered ambitious and something of a braggart, the other Jaycees held him in high regard for his fundraising work, and in 1967 named him Outstanding Vice President of the Waterloo Jaycees. The same year, Gacy served on the board of directors. Assault of Donald Voorhees. Witness intimidation. Conviction and imprisonment. Returned to Chicago. Gacy was granted parole with 12 months probation on June 18, 1970, after having served 18 months of his 10-year sentence. Conditions of his probation included that Gacy relocate to Chicago to live with his mother, and that he must observe a 10 p.m. curfew. On his release, Gacy told friend and fellow Jaycee Clarence Lane, who picked him up from the prison and had remained steadfast in his belief of Gacy's innocence, that he would never go back to jail and that he intended to re-establish himself in Waterloo. However, within 24 hours of his release, Gacy had relocated to Chicago. He arrived there by bus on June 19 and shortly thereafter obtained a job as a short-order cook in a restaurant. On February 12, 1971, Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy who claimed that he had lured him into his car at Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal and driven him to his home, where he had attempted to force the boy into sex. The court dismissed this complaint when the boy failed to appear. On June 22, Gacy was arrested and charged with aggravated sexual battery and reckless conduct. The arrest was in response to a complaint filed by a youth who claimed that Gacy had flashed a sheriff's badge, lured him into his car, and forced him to perform oral sex. These charges were dropped after the complainant attempted to blackmail Gacy. The Iowa Board of Parole did not learn of these incidents, and 8 months later, in October 1971, Gacy's parole ended. The following month, the records of Gacy's previous criminal convictions in Iowa were sealed. 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. With financial assistance from his mother, Gacy bought a ranch house near the village of Norridge in Norwood Park Township, an unincorporated area of Cook County, itself a part of metropolitan Chicago. He resided at the address, 8213 West Summerdale Avenue until his arrest Indiana December 1978 and, according to Gacy, committed all his murders there. Gacy was active in his local community and helpful towards his neighbors. He willingly loaned his construction tools and plowed snow from neighborhood walks free of charge. Between 1974 and 1978, he hosted annual summer parties, each devoted to a particular theme. These events were attended by up to 400 people, including politicians. Second marriage and divorce. In August 1971, shortly after Gacy and his mother moved into the house, he became engaged to Carol Hoff, whom he had briefly dated in high school. They were married on July 1, 1972. Carol and her 2 young daughters from a previous marriage moved into Gacy's home soon after the couple announced their engagement. His mother moved out of the house shortly before the wedding. By 1975, Gacy had told his wife that he was bisexual. After the couple had sex on Mother's Day that year, he informed her this would be the last time they would ever have sex. He began spending most evenings away from home, only to return in the early hours of the morning with the excuse he had been working late. Carol observed Gacy bringing teenage boys into his garage in the early hours and also found gay pornography and men's wallets and identification inside the house. When she confronted Gacy about who these items belonged to, he informed her angrily that it was none of her business. Following a heated argument when she failed to balance a checkbook correctly in October 1975, Carol asked Gacy for a divorce. He agreed to his wife's request, although, by mutual consent, she continued to live at the West Summerdale house until February 1976, when she and her daughters moved into their own apartment. 1 month later, on March 2, the Gacy's divorce decreed upon the false grounds of Gacy's infidelity with women was finalized. PDM contractors. In 1971, Gacy established a part-time construction business, PDM Contractors. The initials PDM were for painting, decorating, and maintenance. With the approval of his probation officer, Gacy worked evenings on his construction contracts while working as a cook during the day. Initially, he undertook minor repair work, such as sign writing, pouring concrete and redecorating, but later expanded to include projects such as interior design, remodeling, installation, assembly and landscaping. In mid-1973, Gacy quit his job as a cook so he could commit fully to his construction business. By 1975, PDM was expanding rapidly, and Gacy was working up to 16 hours per day. In March 1977, he became a supervisor for PE Systems, a firm specializing in the remodeling of drugstores. Between PE Systems and PDM, Gacy worked on up to 4 projects simultaneously and frequently traveled to other states. By 1978, PDM's annual revenue was over $200,000. Clown. Employees. Politics. Murders. Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys, and buried 26 of them in the crawl space of his house. His victims included people he knew and random individuals lured from Chicago's Greyhound bus station, Bughouse Square, or simply off the streets with the promise of a job with PDM, an offer of drink and or drugs, or money for sex. Some victims were grabbed by force, others conned into believing Gacy was a policeman. Gacy usually lured a lone victim to his house, although on more than one occasion Gacy also had what he called doubles, 2 victims killed in the same evening. Inside Gacy's home, his usual modus operandi was to ply a youth with drink, drugs, or generally gain his trust. He would then produce a pair of handcuffs to show a magic trick, sometimes as part of a clowning routine. He typically cuffed his own hands behind his back, then surreptitiously released himself with the key which he hid between his fingers. He then offered to show his intended victim how to release himself from the handcuffs. With his victim manacled and unable to free himself, Gacy then made a statement to the effect that the trick is, you have to have the key. Gacy referred to this act of restraining his victim as the handcuff trick. Having restrained his victim, Gacy proceeded to rape and torture his captive. He frequently began by sitting on or straddling himself above his victim's chest before forcing the victim to fillet him. Gacy then inflicted acts of torture including burning with cigars, making his captive imitate a horse as he sat on their back and pulled upon makeshift reins around their necks, and violation with foreign objects such as dildos and prescription bottles after he had sodomized his captive. To immobilize his captive's legs before engaging in acts of torture, Gacy frequently manacled their ankles to a 2x4 with handcuffs attached at each end, an act inspired by the Houston mass murders. He also verbally taunted many of his victims throughout their continued abuse, and was known to have dragged or forced several victims to crawl into his bathroom, where he partly drowned them in the bathtub before repeatedly reviving them, enabling him to continue his prolonged assault. In instances when a victim had pleaded to be killed as opposed to continuing to endure torture, Gacy would make a statement to the effect he would kill his victim when he wanted to. Gacy typically murdered his victims by placing a rope tourniquet around their neck before progressively tightening the rope with a hammer handle. He referred to this act as the rope trick, frequently informing his captive, "This is the last trick." In at least one instance, he had read part of Psalm 23 as he tightened the rope around his victim's neck. Occasionally, the victim had convulsed for an hour or two before dying, although several victims died by asphyxiation from cloth gags stuffed deep into their throat. Except for his 2 final victims, all were murdered between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. After death, Gacy usually stored the victims' bodies under his bed for up to 24 hours before burying his victim in the crawl space, where he periodically poured quicklime to hasten the decomposition of his victims. Some victims' bodies were taken to his garage and embalmed prior to their burial. Murder of Timothy McCoy. Gacy's first known murder occurred on January 3, 1972. According to Gacy's later account, following a family party on the evening of January 2, he decided to drive to the Civic Center in the Loop to view a display of ice sculptures in the early hours of the following morning. He then lured a 16-year-old named Timothy Jack McCoy from Chicago's Greyhound bus terminal into his car. McCoy was returning from a Christmas vacation in Michigan to his father's home in Omaha, Nebraska. Gacy took McCoy on a sightseeing tour of Chicago and then drove him to his home with the promise that he could spend the night and be driven back to the station in time to catch his bus. Prior to McCoy's identification, he was known simply as the Greyhound busboy. Gacy claimed he woke early the following morning to find McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway with a kitchen knife in his hand. He then jumped from his bed and McCoy raised both arms in a gesture of surrender, tilting the knife upwards and accidentally cutting Gacy's forearm. Gacy twisted the knife from McCoy's wrist, banged his head against the bedroom wall, kicked him against his wardrobe and walked towards him. McCoy then kicked Gacy in the stomach, doubling him over. Gacy then grabbed McCoy, shouting, "Motherfucker! I'll kill you!" He then wrestled McCoy to the floor and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest as he straddled him. As McCoy lay dying, Gacy claimed he washed the knife in his bathroom, then went to his kitchen and saw an opened carton of eggs and a slab of unsliced bacon on his kitchen table. McCoy had also set the table for two. He had walked into Gacy's room to wake him while absent-mindedly carrying the kitchen knife in his hand. Gacy buried McCoy in his crawl space and later covered his grave with a layer of concrete. In an interview several years after his arrest, Gacy said that immediately after killing McCoy, he felt totally drained, yet noted that as he stabbed McCoy and as he listened to the gurgulations and gasping for air that he had experienced a mind-numbing orgasm. He added, "That's when I realized that death was the ultimate thrill." Second murder. Gacy said the second time he committed murder was around January 1974. This victim remains unidentified. Gacy strangled him and then placed the body in his closet before burial. He later stated that bodily fluids leaked from the victim's mouth and nose, staining his carpet. As a result, Gacy regularly stuffed cloth rags, the victim's own underwear, or a sock into the mouths of subsequent victims to prevent such a leakage from occurring. Murder of John Butkovich. On July 31, 1975, John Butkovich, an 18-year-old PDM employee from Lombard, disappeared. Butkovich's car was found parked near the corner of Sheridan and Lawrence with his jacket and wallet inside and the keys still in the ignition. The day before his disappearance, Butkovich had confronted Gacy over 2 weeks' outstanding back pay. Butkovich's father, a Yugoslav immigrant, called Gacy, who claimed he was happy to help search for his son but was sorry Butkovich had run away. When questioned by police, Gacy said Butkovich and 2 friends had arrived at his house demanding the overdue pay, but they had reached a compromise and all 3 had left. Over the following 3 years, Butkovich's parents called police more than 100 times, urging them to investigate Gacy further. Gacy later admitted to encountering Butkovich exiting his car at the corner of West Lawrence Avenue, waving to attract his attention. According to Gacy, Butkovich approached his car, stating, "I want to talk to you." Gacy invited Butkovich into his car, then invited him back to his home, ostensibly to settle the issue of his overdue wages. At his home, Gacy offered Butkovich a drink, then conned him into allowing his wrists to be cuffed behind his back. Gacy later confessed to having sat on the kid's chest for a while before he strangled him. He stowed Butkovich's body in his garage, intending to bury the body later in the crawl space. When his wife and stepdaughters returned home earlier than expected, Gacy buried Butkovich's body under the concrete floor of the tool room extension of his garage in an empty space where he had initially intended to dig a drain tile. Cruising years. In addition to being the year his business expanded, Gacy freely admitted that 1975 was also when he began to increase the frequency of his excursions for sex with young males. He often referred to these jaunts as cruising. Gacy committed most of his murders between 1976 and 1978, as he largely lived alone following his divorce. He later referred to these as his cruising years. Although Gacy remained gregarious and civic-minded, several neighbors noticed erratic changes in his behavior after his 1976 divorce. This included seeing him keeping company with young males, hearing his car arrive or depart in the early hours of the morning, or seeing lights in his home switch on and off in the early hours. One neighbor later recollected that, for several years, the sounds of muffled high-pitched screaming, shouting, and crying had repeatedly awakened her and her son in the early morning hours. She identified the sounds as emanating from a house adjacent to theirs on West Somerdale Avenue. 1976, 1977, 1978. Murder of Robert Piest. Investigation. When Piest failed to return, his family filed a missing person report with the Des Plaines police. Torf named Gacy as the contractor Piest had most likely left the store to talk to about a job. Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak, whose son attended Maine West High School like Piest, chose to investigate Gacy further. Having spoken with Piest's mother on the morning of December 12, Kozenzak became convinced Piest had not run away from home. A routine check of Gacy's criminal background revealed that he had an outstanding battery charge against him in Chicago and had served a prison sentence in Iowa for the sodomy of a 15-year-old boy. Kozenzak and 2 Des Plaines police officers visited Gacy at his home the following evening. Gacy indicated he had seen 2 youths working at the pharmacy and that he had asked one of them, whom he believed to be Piest, whether there were any remodeling materials behind the store. He was adamant, however, that he had not offered Piest a job, and had only returned to the pharmacy shortly after 8 p.m. as he had left his appointment book at the store. Gacy promised to come to the station later that evening to make a statement confirming this, indicating he was unable to do so at that moment as his uncle had just died. When questioned as to how soon he could come to the police station, he responded, "You guys are very rude. Don't you have any respect for the dead?" At 3:20 a.m., Gacy arrived at the police station covered in mud, claiming he had been involved in a car accident. On returning to the police station later that day, Gacy denied any involvement in Piest's disappearance and repeated that he had not offered him a job. When asked why he had returned to the pharmacy, Gacy reiterated that he had done so in response to a phone call from Torf informing him he had left his appointment book at the store. Detectives had already spoken with Torf, who denied calling Gacy. At the request of detectives, Gacy prepared a written statement detailing his movements on December 11. First search warrant. Suspecting Gacy might be holding Piest against his will at his home, Des Plaines police obtained a warrant to search Gacy's house on December 13. This search of Gacy's property revealed several suspicious items, including several police badges and a 6mm Brevettata starter pistol inside an office drawer, and a syringe and hypodermic needle inside a cabinet in Gacy's bathroom. Investigators also found handcuffs, several books on homosexuality and pederasty with titles such as The Great White Swallow and Pretty Boys Must Die, 7 pornographic films, capsules of amyl nitrite, and an 18-in dildo in Gacy's bedroom. A 39-in 2x4 with 2 holes drilled into each end, bottles of Valium and atropine, and several driver's licenses were found in the northwest bedroom. A blue hooded parka was found atop a toolbox inside the laundry room, and underwear too small to fit Gacy was located inside a bathroom closet. In the northwest bedroom, investigators found a class of 1975 Maine West High School ring engraved with the initials JAS. Investigators also recovered a Nissan Pharmacy photo receipt from a trash can, alongside a 36-in section of nylon rope. Surveillance. The Des Plaines police confiscated Gacy's Oldsmobile and other PDM work vehicles. Police assigned 2-man surveillance teams to monitor Gacy on a rotational 12-hour basis as they continued their investigation into his background and potential involvement in Piest's disappearance. These surveillance teams consisted of officers Mike Albrecht and David Hockmeister, and Ronald Robinson and Robert Schultz. The following day, investigators received a phone call from Michael Rossi, who informed the investigators of Gregory Godzik's disappearance and the fact that another PDM employee, Charles Hadala, had been found drowned in an Illinois river earlier that year. On December 15, Des Plaines investigators obtained further details of Gacy's battery charge, learning the complainant, Jeffrey Rignall, had reported that Gacy had lured him into his car, then chloroformed, raped and tortured him before dumping him, with severe chest and facial burns and rectal bleeding, in Lincoln Park the following morning. In an interview with Gacy's former wife the same day, they learned of the disappearance of John Butkovich. The same day, the Maine West High School ring was traced to a John Allen SZYC. An interview with SZYC's mother revealed that several items from her son's apartment were also missing, including a Motorola TV set. By December 16, Gacy was becoming affable with the surveillance detectives, regularly inviting them to join him for meals in restaurants and occasionally for drinks in bars or at his home. He repeatedly denied that he had anything to do with Piast's disappearance and accused the officers of harassing him because of his political connections or because of his recreational drug use. Knowing these officers were unlikely to arrest him on anything trivial, he taunted them by flouting traffic laws and succeeded in losing his pursuers more than once. That afternoon, Cram consented to a police interview, in which he described Gacy's hard-working lifestyle and open-minded attitude about sex between men. Cram also revealed that, because of his poor timekeeping, Gacy had once given him a watch, explaining he got it from a dead person. Investigators conducted a formal interview of Rossi on December 17. He informed them Gacy had sold SZYC's vehicle to him, explaining that he had bought the car from SZYC because he needed money to move to California. A further examination of Gacy's Oldsmobile was conducted on this date. In the course of examining the trunk of the car, investigators discovered a small cluster of fibers they suspected to be human hair. That evening, officers conducted a test using 3 trained German Shepherd search dogs to determine whether Piast had been present in any of Gacy's vehicles. One dog approached Gacy's Oldsmobile and lay on the passenger seat in what the dog's handler informed investigators was a death reaction, indicating Piast's body had been present in the vehicle. That evening, Gacy invited detectives Albrecht and Hochmeister to a restaurant for a meal. In the early hours of December 18, he invited them into another restaurant where, over breakfast, he talked of his business, his marriages, and his activities as a registered clown. At one point during the conversation, Gacy remarked, "You know, clowns can get away with murder." Civil suit. By December 18, Gacy was beginning to display signs of strain from the constant surveillance. He was unshaven, looked tired, appeared anxious, and was drinking heavily. That afternoon, he drove to his lawyer's office to prepare a $750,000 civil suit against the Des Plaines police, demanding that they cease their surveillance. The same day, the serial number of the Nissan Pharmacy photo receipt found in Gacy's kitchen was traced to 17-year-old Kimberly Byers, a colleague of Piast at Nissan Pharmacy. Byers admitted, when contacted in person the following day, that she had worn the jacket on December 11 to shield herself from the cold. She had placed the receipt in the parka pocket just before she gave the coat to Piast as he left the store, claiming a contractor wanted to speak with him. This statement contradicted Gacy's previous statements that he had had no contact with Robert Piast on the evening of December 11. Second search warrant. The same evening, Rossi was interviewed a second time. This time he was more cooperative. He informed detectives that in the summer of 1977, at Gacy's behest, he had spread 10 bags of lime in the crawl space of Gacy's house. On December 19, investigators began compiling evidence for a second search warrant for Gacy's house. The same day, Gacy's lawyers filed the civil suit against the Des Plaines police. The hearing for the suit was scheduled for December 22. That afternoon, Gacy invited the surveillance detectives inside his house again. As Officer Robinson distracted Gacy with conversation, Officer Schultz walked into Gacy's bedroom in an unsuccessful attempt to write down the serial number of the Motorola TV set they suspected belonged to John SZYC. While flushing Gacy's toilet, the officer noticed a smell he suspected could be that of rotting corpses emanating from a heating duct. The officers who had searched Gacy's house previously had failed to notice this, as the house had been cold. Investigators interviewed both Cram and Rossi on December 20. Rossi had agreed to be interviewed in relation to his possible links with John Szyc as well as the disappearance of Robert Piest. When questioned by Kozenzak as to where he believed Gacy had concealed Piest's body, Rossi replied Gacy may have placed the body in the crawl space, adding that he thought Szyc's car was stolen. Rossi agreed to submit to a polygraph test. He denied any involvement in Piest's disappearance, also denying any knowledge of his whereabouts. He soon refused to continue the questioning, and Rossi's erratic and inconsistent responses to questions while attached to the polygraph machine rendered Kozenzak unable to render a definite opinion as to the truthfulness of his answers. Rossi did, however, further discuss the trench digging he did in the crawl space and remarked on Gacy's insistence that he not deviate from where he was instructed to dig. Cram informed investigators of Gacy's attempts to rape him in 1976. He stated that after he and Gacy had returned to his home after the December 13 search of his property, Gacy had turned pale after seeing a clot of mud on his carpet which he suspected had come from his crawl space. Cram said Gacy had grabbed a flashlight and immediately entered the crawl space to look for evidence of digging. When asked whether he had been to the crawl space, Cram replied he had once been asked by Gacy to spread lime down there and had also dug trenches, which Gacy had explained were for drainage pipes. Cram stated these trenches were 2 feet wide, 6 feet long and 2 feet deep, the size of graves. Confession. Arrest. Search for victims. Crawl space. Des Plaines River. Trial. Gacy was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, charged with 33 murders. He was tried in Cook County, Illinois, before Judge Louis Garippo. The jury was selected from Rockford, because of extensive press coverage in Cook County. At the request of his defense counsel, Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors at the Menard Correctional Center in Chester in the year before his trial. He underwent a variety of psychological tests before a panel of psychiatrists to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Gacy attempted to convince the doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. He claimed to have 4 personalities: the hard-working, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and a policeman called Jack Hanley, whom he referred to as Bad Jack. When Gacy had confessed to police, he claimed to be relaying the crimes of Jack, who detested homosexuality and who viewed male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and degraded scum. His lawyers opted to have Gacy plead not guilty by reason of insanity to the charges against him. Presenting Gacy as a Jekyll and Hyde character, the defense produced several psychiatric experts who had examined Gacy. 3 psychiatric experts at Gacy's trial testified they found him to be a paranoid schizophrenic with multiple personalities. The prosecutors presented the case that Gacy was sane and in full control of his actions. To support this contention, they produced several witnesses to testify to the premeditation of Gacy's actions and the efforts he took to escape detection. Those doctors refuted the defense doctors' claims of multiple personalities and insanity. Cram and Rossi testified that Gacy had made them dig drainage trenches and spread bags of lime in his crawl space. Both said Gacy looked periodically into the crawl space to ensure they and other employees they supervised did not deviate from the precise locations he had marked. On February 18, Robert Stein testified that all the bodies recovered from Gacy's property were markedly decomposed, putrefied, skeletalized remains, and that of all the autopsies he performed, 13 victims had died of asphyxiation, 6 of ligature strangulation, 1 of multiple stab wounds to the chest and 10 in undetermined ways. When Gacy's defense team suggested that all 33 deaths were caused by accidental erotic asphyxia, Stein called this highly improbable. Jeffrey Rignall testified on behalf of the defense on February 21. Recounting his ordeal, Rignall wept repeatedly while describing Gacy's torture of him in March 1978. Asked whether Gacy appreciated the criminality of his actions, Rignall said he believed that Gacy was unable to conform his actions to the law's expectations because of the beastly and animalistic ways he attacked me. During specific cross-examination relating to the torture, Rignall vomited and was excused from further testimony. On February 29, Donald Voorhees, whom Gacy sexually assaulted in 1967, testified to his ordeal at Gacy's hands and his subsequent attempts to dissuade him from testifying by paying another youth to spray mace in his face and beat him. Voorhees felt unable to testify but did briefly attempt to do so before being asked to step down. Robert Donnelly testified the week after Voorhees, recounting his ordeal at Gacy's hands in December 1977. Donnelly was visibly distressed as he recalled the abuse he endured and came close to breaking down several times. As Donnelly testified, Gacy repeatedly laughed at him, but Donnelly finished his testimony. During Donnelly's cross-examination, one of Gacy's defense attorneys, Robert Mata, attempted to discredit his testimony, but Donnelly did not waver from his testimony of what had occurred. During the fifth week of the trial, Gacy wrote a personal letter to Judge Garippo requesting a mistrial for reasons including that he did not approve of his lawyer's insanity plea, that his lawyers had not allowed him to take the witness stand, that his defense had not called enough medical witnesses, and that the police were lying with regard to verbal statements he had allegedly made to detectives after his arrest, and that, in any event, the statements were self-ing for use by the prosecution. Judge Garippo addressed Gacy's letter by informing him that both counsels had not been denied the opportunity or funds to summon expert witnesses to testify, and that, under the law, he had the choice whether he wished to testify, and was free to indicate as much to the judge if he wished to do so. Closing arguments. On March 11, final arguments by both prosecution and defense attorneys began. They concluded the following day. Prosecuting attorney Terry Sullivan spoke first, outlining Gacy's history of abusing youths, the testimony of his efforts to avoid detection, and describing his surviving victims Voorhees and Donnelly as living dead. Referring to Gacy as the worst of all murderers, Sullivan stated, "John Gacy has accounted for more human devastation than many earthly catastrophes, but one must tremble. I tremble when thinking about just how close he came to getting away with it all." After the state's 4-hour closing, counsel Sam Amarant spoke for the defense. Amarant argued against the testimony delivered by the doctors who had testified for the prosecution, repeatedly citing the testimony of the 4 psychiatrists and psychologists who had testified on behalf of the defense. Amarant also accused Sullivan of scarcely referring to the evidence presented throughout the trial in his own closing argument, and of arousing hatred against his client. The defense lawyer attempted to portray Gacy as a man driven by compulsions he was unable to control, contending the state had not met their burden of proving Gacy sane beyond a reasonable doubt. In support of these arguments, the defense referred to the testimony of the doctors who had appeared for the defense, in addition to defense witnesses such as Jeffrey Rignall and a former business associate of Gacy's named Michael Ride, both of whom had testified to their belief that Gacy had been unable to control his actions. Amarant then urged the jury to put aside any prejudice they held against his client and asked they deliver a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, adding that Gacy was a danger to both himself and to others, and that studying his psychology and behavior would be of benefit to science. On the morning of March 12, William Kunkel continued to argue for the prosecution. Kunkel referred to the defense's contention of insanity as a sham, arguing that the facts of the case demonstrated Gacy's ability to think logically and control his actions. Kunkel also referred to the testimony of one of the doctors who had examined Gacy in 1968 and had concluded he was an antisocial personality, capable of committing crimes without remorse and unlikely to benefit from social or psychiatric treatment, stating that had the recommendations of this doctor been heeded, Gacy would not have been freed. At the close of his argument, Kunkel removed photos of Gacy's 22 identified victims from a display board and asked the jury not to show sympathy but to show justice. Kunkel then asked the jury to show the same sympathy this man showed when he took these lives and put them there, before throwing the stack of photos into the opening of the trap door from Gacy's crawl space, which had been introduced as evidence and was on display in the courtroom. After Kunkel had finished his testimony, the jury retired to consider their verdict. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and found Gacy guilty of 33 charges of murder. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child, both convictions in reference to Robert Piest. At the time, his conviction for 33 murders was the most for which any person in U.S. history had been convicted. In the sentencing phase of the trial, the jury deliberated for more than 2 hours before sentencing Gacy to death for each murder committed after the Illinois statute on capital punishment came into effect in June 1977. His execution was set for June 2, 1980. Death row. On being sentenced, Gacy was transferred to the Menard Correctional Center, where he remained incarcerated on death row for 14 years. Before his trial, Gacy initiated contact with WELL-TV journalist Russ Ewing, to whom he granted numerous interviews between 1979 and 1981. Ewing later collaborated with author Tim Cahill to publish the book Buried Dreams. The information Gacy divulged to Ewing regarding the circumstances of his first murder would prove instrumental in establishing the identity of his first victim. On February 15, 1983, Henry Brisbane, a fellow death row inmate known as the I-57 Killer, stabbed Gacy in the upper arm with a sharpened wire as Gacy was participating in a voluntary work program. A second death row inmate injured in the attack, William Jones, received a superficial stab wound to the head. Both received treatment in the prison hospital for their wounds. Appeals. After his incarceration, Gacy read numerous law books and filed voluminous motions and appeals, although he did not prevail in any of them. His appeals related to issues such as the validity of the first search warrant granted to the Des Plaines Police on December 13, 1978, and his objection to his lawyer's insanity plea defense at his trial. Gacy also contended that, although he had some knowledge of 5 of the murders, the other 28 murders had been committed by employees who had keys to his house while he was away on business trips. In mid-1984, the Supreme Court of Illinois upheld Gacy's conviction and ordered his execution by lethal injection on November 14. Gacy filed an appeal against this decision, which was denied by the Supreme Court of the United States on March 4, 1985. The following year, Gacy filed a further post-conviction petition, seeking a new trial. His then defense lawyer, Richard Kling, argued that Gacy had been provided with ineffective legal counsel at his 1980 trial. This post-conviction petition was dismissed on September 11, 1986. Gacy appealed the 1985 decision that he be executed. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld his conviction on September 29, 1988, setting a new execution date of January 11, 1989. After the U.S. Supreme Court denied Gacy's final appeal in October 1993, the Illinois Supreme Court formally set an execution date for May 10, 1994. Execution. On the morning of May 9, 1994, Gacy was transferred from the Menard Correctional Center to Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. That evening, he observed prayer with a Catholic priest before being escorted to the Stateville execution chamber to receive a lethal injection. Before the execution began, the chemicals used to effect the execution solidified unexpectedly, clogging the 4-tube used to administer the chemicals into Gacy's arm, complicating the procedure. Blinds covering the window through which witnesses observed the execution were drawn. The execution team replaced the clogged tube. After 10 minutes, the blinds were reopened, and the execution resumed. The entire procedure took 18 minutes. Anesthesiologists blamed the problem on the prison officials' inexperience at conducting an execution, saying that had correct execution procedures been followed, the complications would never have occurred. This error apparently led to Illinois adopting an alternative method of lethal injection. On this subject, one prosecutor at Gacy's trial, William Kunkel, said, "He got a much easier death than any of his victims." According to published reports, Gacy was a diagnosed psychopath who did not express any remorse for his crimes. His final statement to his lawyer before his execution was that killing him would not compensate for the loss of others, and that the state was murdering him. His final spoken words were reported to be "kiss my ass." In the hours leading up to Gacy's execution, a crowd estimated at over 1,000 gathered outside the correctional center. A vocal majority were in favor of the execution, although a small number of anti-death penalty protesters were also present. Some of those in favor of the execution wore T-shirts hearkening to Gacy's previous community services as a clown and bearing satirical slogans such as "No Tears for the Clown." The anti-death penalty protesters present observed a silent candlelight vigil. After Gacy's death was confirmed at 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, his brain was removed. It is in the possession of Helen Morrison, a witness for the defense at Gacy's trial, who has interviewed Gacy and other serial killers in an attempt to isolate common personality traits of violent sociopaths. His body was cremated. Victims. Identified victims. Only 28 of Gacy's victims have been conclusively identified. Of these, the youngest were Samuel Stapleton and Michael Marino, both 14, the eldest were Francis Alexander and Russell Nelson, both 21. 5 victims have never been identified. The first victims to be identified were John Butkovich, John Szyc, and Gregory Godzik. Dental records confirmed their identities on December 29, 1978. The 33rd victim linked to Gacy, James Matsara, was identified the following day. The 23rd victim exhumed from Gacy's property was identified as Rick Johnston on January 1, 1979. 4 further victims were identified on January 6, 1979. Body 18 was identified as Michael Bonin and Body 25 as Robert Gilroy. The first victim exhumed from the crawl space was identified as John Prestige, and the victim labeled Body 16 as Russell Nelson. A fishing license issued to Bonin had been found previously in Gacy's home. 3 days later, the victim recovered from the Des Plaines River on June 30, 1978, was identified as Timothy O'Rourke. On January 27, dental charts were used to identify Body 20 as John Mowry. 2 days later, Body 8 was identified as Matthew Bowman. 2 months later, on March 17, 1979, the 22nd victim recovered from Gacy's property was identified using dental records as William Carroll. The following month, the identity of the 7th victim was confirmed using X-ray records as Randall Reffitt, and on May 21, dental records confirmed that Body 27 was William Kindred. On September 11, 1979, bodies 11 and 12 were identified as Robert Winch and Tommy Bowling, respectively. Winch was identified via X-ray records of a distinctive healed bone fracture. A distinctive brown tiger's eye metal buckle with black striping belonging to Winch was also found alongside his body. Using dental records, the 6th victim exhumed from Gacy's property was identified on November 14, 1979, as Samuel Stapleton. On November 16, Body 17 was identified as David Talsma using radiology images of a healed fracture of the left scapula. 2 days later, the final victim recovered from Gacy's property, body 29, was identified as Daryl Sampson. On March 29, 1980, bodies 14 and 15 were identified using dental records and radiology images as those of Michael Marino and Kenneth Parker. Their identities were confirmed too late to include among the victims identified before Gacy's trial. In May 1986, the ninth victim exhumed from Gacy's property was identified as Timothy Jack McCoy, Gacy's first victim. Dental records and a distinctive belt buckle assisted with his identification. Renewed efforts. Summary. Unidentified victims. 5 victims still remain unidentified, 4 of whom had been buried beneath Gacy's crawl space, and 1 buried approximately 15 feet from the barbecue pit in his backyard. In the fall of 1979, forensic expert Betty Pat Gatliff used the skulls of the remaining unidentified victims to create facial reconstructions. Based on Gacy's confession, the location of the victims buried in the crawl space, and forensic analysis, police determined the most likely dates for when his unidentified victims were killed. January 3, 1972 – July 31, 1975. Body 28. Backyard. Male aged 14–18. June 13 – August 5, 1976. Body 26. Crawl space. Male aged 23–30. August 6 – October 5, 1976. Body 13. Crawl space. Male aged 17–22. August 6 – October 24, 1976. Body 21. Crawl space. Male aged 15–24. March 15 – July 5, 1977. Body 10. Crawl space. Male aged 17–21. Gacy's likely second murder victim, body 28, had brown hair, stood approximately 5 feet 9 in height, and is estimated to be aged between 14 and 18. He was buried near Gacy's barbecue pit, possibly in 1975. He wore a silver ring on his left ring finger, suggesting he may have been married. Body 26 was a man with medium dark brown hair estimated to have been aged between 23 and 30 years old and approximately 5 feet 4 in height. This man had 2 missing upper front teeth, leading investigators to believe he likely wore a denture. He was almost certainly murdered between June 13 and August 5, 1976. Body 13 was a man likely to have been murdered between August and October 1976. He was between 5 feet 9 and 6 feet 2 in height. He had long, dark brown, wavy hair and was between 17 and 22 years old. This victim suffered from an abscessed tooth and may have injured his left third rib months or years before his disappearance. While Rossi also claimed to have dug this grave in the late summer of 1977, Cram claimed that during his time living at 8213 W. Summerdale, Gacy had him dig a trench in the southwest corner of the crawl space where this victim was recovered. In 2018, an updated facial reconstruction was released to the media. Body 21 is estimated to have been aged between 15 and 24 years old and approximately 5 feet 10 in height. He had light brown hair. This victim was buried directly above the body of William Carroll, indicating his murder had occurred on or after June 13, 1976. It is theorized Cram may not have lived with Gacy at the time of this victim's death, so a possible date for this murder is between August 6 and 20, 1976, although investigators have not discounted the possibility he may have been murdered later in 1976. Body 10 is estimated to have been aged between 17 and 21 years old and between 5 feet 7 in and 5 feet 11 in. He had suffered a fractured left collarbone months or years before his disappearance. The 2 victims murdered on the same day in May 1976 were buried alongside him, yet sequential burial patterns of 3 victims murdered in 1977 leave an equal possibility he may have been murdered in the spring or summer of 1977. Statements made by Gacy following his arrest also suggest this unidentified victim may have been murdered as early as 1974. In 2018, an updated facial reconstruction was released to the media. Possible additional victims. At the time of Gacy's arrest, he had claimed to both Des Plaines and Chicago investigators that the total number of murder victims could be as high as 45. However, only 33 victims were ever linked to Gacy. Investigators excavated the grounds of his property until they had exposed the substratum of clay beneath the foundations, finding 29 bodies. Shortly after his arrest, Gacy informed investigators that after he had assaulted and then released Jeffrey Rignall in March 1978, he began to throw his murder victims into the Des Plaines River. He confessed to having disposed of 5 bodies in this manner. However, only 4 bodies recovered from the Des Plaines River were linked to him. When asked whether there were more victims, Gacy stated, "That's for you guys to find out." Identification dispute of Michael Marino. Disputed DNA and dental tests conducted between 2012 and 2016 indicate that neither body found in the common grave in Gacy's crawl space and identified as those of Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino in 1980 was actually Marino. Marino's mother had always doubted her son's identification because the clothing found on body 14 was inconsistent with what he had worn when she last saw him. DNA testing conducted upon the exhumed body of Parker has proven that Marino's body had not been mistaken for his. In addition, the dental X-ray conducted on the victim identified as Michael Marino had revealed they had all of their second molars. A dental X-ray conducted on Marino in March 1976 revealed 1 molar had not erupted. The original identification of the body identified as Michael Marino has been disputed because the exhumed body had neither an upper nor lower jaw bone. Nonetheless, the orthodontist who had identified Marino's remains has stated his conviction in the accuracy of his findings, adding he had compared 32 teeth, probably half a dozen of them had very distinct fillings and every one of them was consistent with Michael Marino. Death of Charles Hattala. On May 23, 1978, 25-year-old Charles Antonio Hattala was found drowned in the Pecatonica River near Freeport, Illinois. He had been missing since May 13. Hattala was an employee of PDM and had been linked to the initial investigation of Gacy after Michael Rossi informed investigators of both Godzik's disappearance and Hattala's death. Moreover, Rossi had stated that Hattala was known to have conflicts with Gacy, and when he had failed to show up at work, Gacy had informed him and several other employees that he had drowned. At the time of Hattala's death, no more bodies could be stored in Gacy's crawl space, which leaves a possibility he had disposed of Hattala's body in the Pecatonica River. However, Des Plaines authorities had contacted Freeport during their investigation into Gacy, and were told Hattala had fallen to his death from a bridge. Hattala's death has been officially ruled as asphyxia by drowning. West Miami Avenue. Retired Chicago police officer Bill Dorsch stated he had reason to believe there might be more victims buried in the grounds of the apartment building located at the 6100 block of West Miami Avenue in Chicago, a property where Gacy had been the caretaker for several years before his 1978 arrest. In 1975, Dorsch, then a Chicago police officer, observed Gacy holding a shovel in the early hours of the morning. When Dorsch confronted him, Gacy said he was doing work that he was too busy to do during the day. Dorsch also said that several other residents of West Miami Avenue stated they had seen Gacy digging trenches in the grounds of the property in the early to mid-1970s. One of these residents also said that Gacy later placed plants in the elongated trenches he had dug. At the time these actions were observed, Gacy was still married to Carol Hoff. In March 2012, Cook County Sheriff's officials submitted a request to excavate the grounds of this property. The Cook County State's Attorney denied the request, citing a lack of probable cause as the reason, including the results of a 1998 search of the property. However, the Sheriff's Office noted that in 1998, a radar survey suggested 14 areas of interest within the property grounds, yet only 2 of these 14 anomalies had been excavated. Of the 12 remaining anomalies, 4 were described as being staggeringly suggestive of human skeletons. Moreover, Bill Dorsch had provided police with a letter from the radar company which confirmed the 1998 search of the grounds was incomplete. A second request to excavate the grounds of West Miami Avenue was submitted to the Cook County State's Attorney by Sheriff Tom Dart in October 2012. This request was granted in January 2013, and a search of the property was conducted in the spring. Both FBI sniffer dogs and ground-penetrating radar equipment were used in the second search of West Miami Avenue. However, the search yielded no human remains. Potential accomplices. One of the first things Gacy told investigators after his arrest was that he had not acted alone in several of the murders. He asked whether my associates had been arrested. When questioned whether these associates had participated directly or indirectly in the killings, Gacy replied, "Directly." He later claimed Cram and Rossi were involved in several of the murders. Some criminal defense attorneys and investigators researching the possibility Gacy had not acted alone in several of the murders have said there is overwhelming evidence Gacy worked with an accomplice. In the 1980s, Gacy informed FBI profiler Robert Ressler that 2 or 3 PDM employees had assisted in several murders. Ressler believed there were unexplained avenues to the case and that Gacy had killed more than 33 victims in multiple states. Gacy neither confirmed nor denied Ressler's suspicions. Jeffrey Rignall, who had been assaulted and tortured by Gacy in March 1978, was adamant that at one point during his abuse and torture, a young man with brown hair had knelt before him and watched his abuse. Rignall also said that he saw a light come on in another part of the house. On one occasion, 3 days before his arrest, during their surveillance of Gacy, 2 officers followed him to a bar where he met 2 employees, Michael Rossi and Ed Hefner. An anxious Gacy was observed walking with the 2 out of earshot of the surveillance officers to talk privately before returning closer to the officers. Gacy said to both young men, "You'd better not let me down, you fuckers. You owe it to me." The officers then overheard sections of a hushed conversation between Gacy and the 2 during which Rossi asked Gacy, "And what? Buried like the other 5? In interviews from death row, Gacy said that at the time of his arrest, 3 PDM employees were also considered suspects in the murders, all of whom he said were in possession of keys to his house. In addition to Cram and Rossi, Gacy named his former employee Philip Paske, who was a close associate of John Norman and an acquaintance of David Cram. In the late 1970s, Norman operated a nationwide sex trafficking ring based in Chicago known as the Delta Project. At least 2 victims believed to have been murdered by Gacy, Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino, were last been seen alive close to where Norman lived. This led to the theory that Gacy had been connected to this trafficking ring. Later investigations. Gacy claimed that he was not in Chicago when 16 of the identified victims had disappeared. In 2012, 2 Chicago lawyers said travel records show that he had been in another state at the time of 3 of the murders, implying he was assisted by 1 or more accomplices. For example, Gacy had flown to Pittsburgh via Allegheny Airlines 3 days before the disappearance of Robert Gilroy, and returned to Chicago only the day after he disappeared. Investigators note that Robert Young, the traveling companion with whom victim Russell Nelson was visiting Chicago at the time of his October 1977 disappearance, gave differing accounts of his disappearance to Nelson's family and investigators. Young told Nelson's family he failed to arrive at a bar at a prearranged time, but had told investigators he had last seen Nelson standing in a crowd that had gathered outside a Chicago bar, and when his attention was diverted for a few moments, Nelson had simply disappeared. Investigators contend this could not have happened without Young noticing. Young filed a missing persons report with Chicago police, before unsuccessfully requesting money from Nelson's parents to finance a search for their son. When Nelson's two brothers arrived in Chicago to search for him, Young offered them a job with PDM. Young was never summoned to testify at Gacy's trial. He died in 1987. In a third case, travel records indicate Gacy was at a scheduled job site in Michigan at 6 a.m. on September 26, 1977, the day following the disappearance of 19-year-old John Mowry, who was last seen leaving his mother's house at 10 p.m. on September 25. Mowry's roommate was a PDM employee who formerly lived with Gacy and had moved into Mowry's apartment less than 1 week before Mowry's disappearance. Two witnesses have stated that this roommate had suggested to Mowry that he meet a man who is going out of town 2 days before Mowry disappeared. Notoriety. Amber Alert. In 1984, Sam Amarant, one of Gacy's two defense attorneys at his 1980 trial, authored procedures that were incorporated by the Illinois General Assembly into the Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984. Amarant has since said the primary inspiration for this legislation was that at the time of the Gacy murders, Illinois police had to wait 72 hours before initiating a search for a missing child or adolescent. The Illinois Missing Child Recovery Act of 1984 removed the 72-hour waiting period. Other states across America subsequently adopted similar procedures. As a result, a national network aimed at locating missing children was gradually formed. This has since developed into the child abduction emergency commonly known today as an Amber Alert. Paintings. Isolated in his prison cell, Gacy began to paint. He drew inspiration from a wide range of sources for his artwork, with his paintings depicting subjects as diverse as Christ, birds, skulls, his own home, and John Dillinger. Many paintings were of clowns, including himself as Pogo or Patches. His Hi-Ho series featured scenes of Walt Disney's versions of the Seven Dwarfs. Although Gacy was permitted to earn money from the sale of his paintings until 1985, he claimed his artwork was intended to bring joy into people's lives. Many of Gacy's paintings have been displayed at exhibitions, others have been sold at various auctions, with individual prices ranging between $200 to $20,000. Following Gacy's execution, family members of his victims publicly burned several of his paintings. Films and documentary. Film and television. Documentary. See also: Capital punishment in Illinois. List of people executed in Illinois. List of serial killers by number of victims. List of serial killers in the United States. List of unidentified murder victims in the United States. Notes. References.